"You don't deserve Grandma's house, Evelyn. Daniel does." My mother said it so calmly that for a second I thought I had misunderstood her. We were sitting around the dining room table in the old farmhouse where my grandmother, Margaret Parker, had lived for more than 40 years. The funeral had been 3 days earlier. The flowers were still fresh. Sympathy cards still covered the sideboard. Yet somehow the conversation had already turned to property, inheritance, and who deserved what. I stared at my mother across the table. Susan Parker looked perfectly composed in a cream-colored sweater, her hands folded neatly in front of her. My older brother Daniel sat beside her, avoiding eye contact as he slowly stirred his coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the late afternoon sun stretched across the fields Grandma had loved so much. Nothing about the scene felt real. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "What did you just say?" My mother sighed as if she were tired of explaining something obvious. "The house should stay with Daniel. He has a family. He has responsibilities. Grandma would have wanted that." I looked from her to my brother. Neither of them seemed uncomfortable. Neither of them seemed surprised. That hurt more than the words themselves. For nearly 7 years, I had been the one driving 2 hours every weekend to help Grandma with groceries, doctor appointments, and repairs around the house. I was the one who sat beside her hospital bed after her knee surgery. I was the one who answered the phone when she felt lonely and needed someone to talk to. Daniel visited on holidays. Sometimes not even then. Yet now everyone seemed ready to pretend none of that had happened. I folded my hands under the table so no one would notice they were shaking. "Grandma never told me that," I said. "Well," my mother replied, taking a sip of coffee, "there are a lot of things your grandmother didn't tell you." The room went quiet. Somewhere down the hall, the grandfather clock chimed 4 times. I remembered standing beside Grandma in this very kitchen 6 months earlier while she rolled pie dough for Thanksgiving. She had smiled at me and said something that seemed strange at the time. "One day, sweetheart, the truth always finds its way home." I had laughed and asked what she meant. She only smiled and changed the subject. Now those words returned to me with unsettling clarity. The truth always finds its way home. I glanced around the room. My mother was already discussing paint colors and renovation ideas with Daniel, speaking as though ownership had already been settled. They talked about converting the spare bedroom into an office. They talked about replacing Grandma's garden with additional parking space. Every sentence felt like a small erasure of the woman I had loved. Finally, I pushed my chair back and stood. "I think I'm going to head home," I said. Neither of them tried very hard to stop me. I walked outside into the cool Ohio evening. The air smelled like freshly cut grass and distant rain. For a long moment, I stood beside my car, staring at Grandma's house. The white porch swing moved gently in the breeze. The same porch swing where she had spent countless summer evenings waving at neighbors and drinking sweet tea. Something felt wrong. Not emotionally wrong. Factually wrong. As I reached for my car door, I found myself remembering that strange sentence again. The truth always finds its way home. I didn't know why those words suddenly mattered so much. I only knew one thing. I wasn't ready to accept what my mother had told me. And for the first time since Grandma's funeral, I began to wonder whether someone in my family was hiding something. The drive back to Columbus usually took a little under 2 hours, but that evening it felt much longer. The highway stretched ahead beneath a gray sky, and my thoughts kept circling the same questions. Why had my mother seemed so certain? Why had Daniel acted as though the decision had already been made? Most of all, why did I feel as though Grandma had tried to tell me something before she died? By the time I pulled into the driveway of my small brick ranch house, the sun had already disappeared behind the trees. I carried my overnight bag inside and set it beside the front door. The silence greeted me immediately. Normally, I appreciated the quiet. That night it felt heavy. I made a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out the window at my backyard. Spring had arrived early in Ohio that year. The flower beds were beginning to bloom, and the maple tree near the fence had tiny green leaves. Grandma would have loved it. She always noticed the smallest signs of a changing season. I found myself thinking about the last few years more than I had in months. After Grandpa passed away, Grandma had insisted she could manage on her own. For a while she did. Then came the doctor appointments, the occasional falls, the difficulty keeping up with household repairs. I never considered helping her a burden. She was family. Every Saturday morning, I made the 2-hour drive to her farmhouse. Sometimes I fixed a leaky faucet. Sometimes I cleaned out gutters. Most of the time, we simply sat on the porch and talked. Daniel rarely came. He always had an explanation. Work deadlines, school events for the children, travel plans. Grandma never complained, but I noticed the disappointment she tried to hide whenever his name came up. Around 9 o'clock that evening, I opened an old photo album that I had brought home after the funeral. The pages smelled faintly of dust and age. There were photographs from family picnics, birthdays, and Christmas mornings. As I turned the pages, I noticed something strange. In nearly every picture from the past decade, I was standing beside Grandma. In most of them, Daniel was missing. The realization made my chest tighten. Not because I wanted credit, because someone was trying to rewrite a story that had actually happened. Near the back of the album, a folded piece of paper slipped onto the table. I picked it up carefully. It was not a legal document. It was simply a grocery list written in Grandma's familiar handwriting. Milk, bread, tomatoes, birdseed. I almost laughed at myself for expecting something important. Then I noticed a sentence scribbled at the bottom. It looked like an afterthought. Do not let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness. I stared at those words for a long time. They felt less like a reminder and more like advice sent forward through time. The next morning, I called the attorney who had handled the funeral arrangements. His receptionist politely informed me that no reading of a will had been scheduled. That surprised me. Most estates followed a predictable process. After I hung up, my uneasiness grew stronger. Something about the situation did not fit together. My mother wanted the discussion closed. Daniel wanted the house sold quickly. No official documents had been presented. No explanations had been offered. As I stood in my kitchen holding my phone, I made a decision. I was finished accepting vague answers. If there was a truth buried somewhere beneath all the silence, I intended to find it. The following Tuesday, I took a personal day from work and drove back to the farmhouse. I told myself I was only looking for answers, but deep down I think I was searching for something else as well. I was searching for reassurance that the woman who had helped raise me had not suddenly become a stranger in death. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled into the driveway. Daniel's truck was not there. Neither was my mother's sedan. For the first time in days, the property sat completely still. I unlocked the front door using the spare key Grandma had given me years earlier. The familiar scent of cedar, old books, and lemon furniture polish greeted me immediately. It felt less like entering a house and more like stepping into a memory. Sunlight filtered through the living room curtains, illuminating tiny particles of dust that drifted through the air. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. Her reading glasses rested beside her favorite chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the side table. Seeing those ordinary details made my throat tighten. For a few minutes, I simply walked through the rooms. Then I remembered something. About a year before she passed away, Grandma had mentioned organizing important documents. At the time, she had laughed and said she was trying to save everyone trouble someday. I headed toward the small study near the back of the house. The room was neat, almost unusually neat. File folders were stacked inside a wooden cabinet. Labels were written in Grandma's careful handwriting. Insurance, taxes, utilities, medical records. I spent nearly an hour looking through them. Everything appeared ordinary. There were no surprises, no hidden revelations. Eventually, frustration began to creep in. Maybe I had imagined the entire thing. Maybe grief was making me suspicious. I was about to close the final drawer when I noticed something tucked against the back panel. A small brass key. It was attached to a faded blue ribbon. I stared at it for several seconds. I had never seen it before. The key was too small for a door and too large for a mailbox. Turning it over in my hand, I noticed a tiny number stamped into the metal. 117. My pulse quickened. I searched the study for anything that might explain it. Nothing. Then another memory surfaced. Years ago, Grandma rented a storage unit after selling some antique furniture from her parents' estate. I had completely forgotten about it. Had she kept it all these years? I slipped the key into my pocket and continued searching. Near the bottom shelf of a bookcase, I found an old appointment calendar. Most entries were mundane. Doctor visits, church events, lunch with friends. But one note near the middle of the previous year caught my attention. Meet Michael. Bring storage documents. Michael, the attorney. I looked at the dates several times. Why would Grandma have been discussing storage documents with her lawyer? The question lingered in my mind all afternoon. As evening approached, I locked the house and returned to my car. The small brass key felt unexpectedly heavy in my pocket. I did not know what it opened. I did not know why Grandma had hidden it. But for the first time since the funeral, I felt something shift. The mystery was no longer a feeling. It was becoming something tangible. And somewhere behind that locked door, whatever it was, I had a growing suspicion that Grandma had left it there for someone specific to find. The next morning, I called the number listed on one of the old receipts I had found tucked inside Grandma's appointment calendar. I did not expect anyone to answer. The paper was several years old, and businesses closed all the time. To my surprise, a receptionist picked up on the second ring. When I gave her the facility name written on the receipt, she confirmed that the storage center was still operating on the north side of town. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind all night. Would a unit number correspond to a key marked 117? There was a brief pause. Yes, she said. That sounds like one of our unit numbers. My grip tightened around the phone. After thanking her, I sat quietly at my kitchen table. The small brass key rested beside my coffee mug. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. A week earlier, it had been nothing more than a forgotten object hidden in a drawer. Now it felt like a message reaching across time. By noon, I was back on the road. The storage facility sat behind a chain-link fence near an industrial area lined with warehouses and delivery trucks. Nothing about the place seemed remarkable. Yet as I parked and walked toward the office, I felt the same nervous anticipation I had experienced before major life events. Inside, a middle-aged manager named Carol greeted me warmly. I explained that my grandmother had recently passed away and that I believed she might have rented a unit there. Carol asked for identification and spent several minutes searching through records on her computer. Finally, she looked up. Margaret Parker did have a unit here, she said. The rental payments were prepaid for several years. My heart skipped. Several years. I repeated. Carol nodded. More than enough time remaining. That detail alone felt strange. Grandma had always been practical with money. She would never have spent extra funds unless she believed something was important. After signing a few documents, I followed Carol through a maze of storage buildings. We stopped in front of a narrow metal door marked 117. The number matched the key exactly. Suddenly, I understood why my grandmother had hidden it. She had wanted someone to find it eventually, but not immediately. Carol unlocked the outer security gate and left me alone. For a moment, I simply stood there holding the brass key. Then I slid it into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly. Inside, the unit was surprisingly organized. Plastic containers lined one wall. Several sealed boxes sat neatly stacked near the back. An old wooden trunk rested in the center. Nothing appeared valuable. No antiques. No obvious treasure. Yet every item seemed deliberately preserved. I opened the nearest container. Family photographs filled the box. Hundreds of them. Many I had never seen before. Another container held letters, greeting cards, and journals spanning decades. As I examined the collection, a realization slowly formed. Grandma had been archiving the history of our family. Not randomly. Methodically. Almost as though she expected someone to need proof of something someday. Then I noticed the trunk. Unlike everything else, it carried a small envelope taped to the lid. My name was written across the front in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting. Just seeing those letters made my pulse race. I carefully peeled the envelope free. Whatever answers I had been searching for, I knew they were finally getting closer. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but I immediately recognized Grandma's handwriting. She had always written in careful blue ink, each letter neat and deliberate. For a moment, I simply stared at my name written across the top of the page. Then I unfolded it and began to read. If you are reading this, Evelyn, it means you followed your instincts. I always admired that about you. I swallowed hard and continued. The letter was not dramatic. It sounded exactly like her. Calm, practical, thoughtful. She wrote about family traditions, about the importance of honesty, and about how easy it was for people to convince themselves that a convenient story was true. Then one sentence made me sit perfectly still. There are documents in this unit that may become important if anyone attempts to ignore my wishes. I read the line twice. Then a third time. My pulse quickened. Grandma had anticipated this. Somehow, long before any of us gathered around that dining room table, she had expected problems. I carefully placed the letter aside and opened the wooden trunk. Inside were several folders organized with handwritten labels. Family records, property documents, correspondence. Legal files. Everything was arranged with the same precision that had defined her entire life. I started with the correspondence folder. Most of the contents were ordinary letters exchanged between relatives over many years. Then I noticed several copies of emails printed on paper. Some were conversations between Grandma and attorney Michael Reynolds. The dates stretched back nearly 3 years. I skimmed through them slowly. The language was formal, but one theme appeared repeatedly. Grandma wanted to ensure that her final wishes would be followed exactly as written. She seemed unusually concerned about misunderstandings. The deeper I looked, the more uneasy I became. Then I found something even stranger. A handwritten journal. The entries covered the final 2 years of her life. Most pages described ordinary events. Church lunches, gardening projects, doctor appointments. But scattered throughout were observations about family members. One entry mentioned Daniel canceling another visit at the last minute. Another noted how disappointed she felt when certain promises were not kept. Yet she never sounded bitter. Only honest. I turned another page and froze. Evelyn spent 6 hours repairing the porch railing today. She never asks for anything in return. A few pages later came another note. People reveal who they are through consistency, not speeches. I sat back against the storage unit wall and closed my eyes. For years, I had assumed Grandma never paid attention to the small things. Apparently, she noticed everything. As afternoon sunlight filtered through the open doorway, I continued sorting through the files. Near the bottom of the trunk, beneath several folders, I discovered a sealed manila envelope bearing the letterhead of Michael Reynolds. Across the front, written in bold black marker, were 6 words. To be opened only if necessary. My breath caught. Suddenly, the entire storage unit seemed quieter. The distant sounds of traffic disappeared from my awareness. I carefully picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have. Whatever was inside had been intentionally separated from everything else. And for the first time since this search began, I had the unmistakable feeling that I was finally standing at the edge of the truth. For several seconds, I simply held the envelope without opening it. The storage unit suddenly felt smaller, as though the air itself had become heavier. I thought about putting it back and walking away. Once I knew the truth, there would be no going back to the comfortable uncertainty that had existed before. But that option had already disappeared the moment I found the key. Slowly, I broke the seal and removed the contents. Inside were several documents clipped together. The first page was a letter from attorney Michael Reynolds addressed to Margaret Parker. I recognized his name immediately. My eyes moved quickly across the page. The letter referenced estate planning, property transfers, and final instructions. Nothing unusual at first. Then I reached a paragraph that made me stop. It confirmed that additional legal protections had been established to ensure that certain assets would pass according to Grandma's direct wishes regardless of outside pressure or family disagreements. Outside pressure. Family disagreements. The phrases echoed in my mind. Beneath the letter sat copies of signed paperwork. I carefully examined each page. Most contained legal language that was difficult to understand without professional guidance. Yet one thing became clear almost immediately. Grandma had been working closely with Michael Reynolds for years, far longer than anyone in the family had ever mentioned. As I continued reading, another folded note slipped free from the stack. Unlike the formal documents, this one was written entirely in Grandma's handwriting. If confusion ever arises, speak directly with Michael. He knows the full story. I stared at the sentence. It was direct, unmistakable. More importantly, it suggested that Michael possessed information I did not yet have. I checked my watch. It was nearly 4 o'clock. On impulse, I searched online for his office number and called. To my surprise, he answered personally. His voice sounded calm and professional. After introducing myself, I explained what I had found. Silence followed for several seconds. Then he spoke carefully. Evelyn, I have been expecting that call for quite some time. A chill ran through me. You knew about the storage unit? I asked. Yes, he replied. Your grandmother instructed me not to discuss certain matters unless specific circumstances occurred. My heart began beating faster. What circumstances? Another pause. If anyone attempted to misrepresent her intentions. I leaned back against a stack of storage containers. Suddenly, every conversation from the past week replayed in my mind. My mother's certainty, Daniel's eagerness, the absence of any official presentation of documents. None of it felt accidental anymore. Michael's voice remained steady. I cannot discuss everything over the phone. However, I believe it is time for us to meet. We arranged an appointment for the following morning at his office. After the call ended, I sat quietly in the storage unit for a long time. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the pavement. Trucks moved in the distance. Somewhere a metal gate rattled in the wind. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Before leaving, I returned the documents to the envelope and placed them carefully inside my bag. As I locked Unit 117 for what I suspected would not be the last time, I realized something important. Until now, I had been chasing suspicions and fragments of evidence. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, for the first time, someone who knew the entire story was finally going to speak. The next morning, I arrived at Michael Reynolds' office 15 minutes early. The building sat on a quiet street near downtown, surrounded by brick storefronts and mature maple trees. I barely noticed any of it. My attention remained fixed on the leather folder resting on the passenger seat beside me. Every document from the storage unit was inside. Every question I had been carrying for days seemed to weigh just as much. Michael greeted me personally when I entered. He looked older than I remembered, with silver hair and reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck, but his expression was kind. He led me into a conference room and closed the door behind us. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he placed a thick file on the table. "Your grandmother was one of the most organized clients I ever had," he said. "She believed that clarity prevented conflict." I almost laughed at the irony. Conflict was exactly what seemed to be growing around her estate. Michael opened the file and removed several documents. "Before we discuss specifics, there is something you need to understand," he said. "Margaret anticipated challenges long before her health declined." I felt my stomach tighten. "Challenges from who?" I asked. Michael studied me carefully. "She never liked making accusations, but she worried that some family members might prioritize convenience over her actual wishes." The room fell silent. I already knew which family members he meant. Michael slid a document toward me. It was a copy of correspondence between him and Grandma from nearly 4 years earlier. I scanned the page. The language was formal, but one section stood out immediately. Grandma specifically requested that certain property records be stored separately from her primary estate file. "Why would she do that?" I asked. Michael folded his hands. "Because she wanted an additional layer of protection." My pulse quickened. He reached into the file again and removed a large sealed envelope. Unlike everything else I had seen, this one carried an official county stamp. "I have been instructed to release this only under very specific circumstances," he said. "And based on everything you have told me, those circumstances now exist." The envelope sat between us. For a moment, neither of us touched it. Then Michael carefully opened the seal and removed several pages. I immediately recognized the format. Property records, official filings, legal descriptions, ownership information. My eyes moved across the text, struggling to process what I was seeing. Michael pointed to a section near the bottom. "Read that line carefully." I did. Then I read it again. My breath caught. The document was not a will. It was not a promise. It was not a future instruction. It was a completed deed. A recorded deed. One that had been legally filed years before Grandma passed away. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. "This cannot be right," I whispered. Michael nodded slowly. "It is right." I looked back down at the page. The farmhouse property had already been transferred. The process had been completed according to state law. The county records confirmed it. The signatures were valid. The filing numbers were legitimate. Most importantly, the designated owner listed on the deed was not Susan Parker. It was not Daniel Parker. It was me, Evelyn Parker. For several seconds, I could not speak. Every conversation from the previous week flashed through my mind. Every confident statement. Every assumption. Every attempt to make me believe I had no place in that house. Yet the truth had been sitting inside an official record all along. And for the first time since this began, I understood exactly why someone had worked so hard to keep me from finding it. When I left Michael's office, I did not feel triumphant. I felt calm. That surprised me more than anything. For days, I had been chasing questions. Now I finally had answers. The deed existed. The county records confirmed it. The farmhouse legally belonged to me. Yet instead of calling my mother immediately, I drove home and spent the evening thinking. Grandma had never rushed into confrontations. She believed facts could speak for themselves if given enough room. The next morning, my phone rang just after breakfast. It was Daniel. I stared at the screen before answering. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Mom is organizing a family meeting this weekend," he said. "We need to discuss the house and get everything finalized." I almost smiled. Finalized. The word carried a completely different meaning now. What exactly needs to be finalized? I asked. Daniel hesitated. The sale process. We have already spoken with a realtor. The market is strong right now. We. Not Grandma. Not the legal owner. Just we. I thanked him for the information and ended the call. A few hours later, my mother called as well. Her tone was polite but firm. She spoke as though decisions had already been made. She discussed property values, repair estimates, and potential buyers. At no point did she ask for my opinion. At no point did she mention legal documents. I listened quietly. The more she spoke, the clearer everything became. They truly believed they were in control of the situation. By Saturday afternoon, the family gathering was underway. The farmhouse looked exactly as it always had. The white porch, the flower beds, the old oak tree near the driveway. Yet something felt different. Perhaps it was because I now understood that Grandma had planned far more carefully than anyone realized. Inside, my mother sat at the dining room table with a folder of paperwork. Daniel occupied the chair beside her. A local realtor joined them as well, reviewing market reports and comparable sales. Everyone appeared confident. Everyone appeared prepared. I took my seat quietly and watched. My mother began outlining her plans. She spoke about timing, taxes, closing costs, future investments. She explained how the proceeds could be divided. Not once did she question whether she possessed the authority to make those decisions. The realtor eventually turned toward me. "Do you have any concerns?" she asked politely. Before I could answer, my mother spoke first. "Evelyn understands the situation." I looked at her across the table. For a brief moment, I saw not anger but certainty. She genuinely believed her version of events would prevail. That was the strange part. The deception had been repeated so many times that it seemed to have become reality in her mind. I slowly reached into my bag and removed the county records. The room immediately grew quieter. Daniel noticed the folder first. His expression shifted. My mother stopped speaking mid-sentence. Without drama, without accusations, I placed the documents on the table and slid them forward. Nobody touched them at first. The silence stretched across the room. Then the realtor picked up the first page. Her eyes moved across the text. She turned to the second page, then the third. When she finally looked up, her professional smile had disappeared completely. And for the first time since Grandma's funeral, I watched certainty leave my mother's face. No one spoke for several seconds. The realtor slowly placed the documents back on the table and looked directly at my mother. "These records appear valid," she said carefully. "If they have been properly recorded with the county, then ownership has already been established." The room felt strangely still. Outside, I could hear wind moving through the old oak tree near the porch. Inside, the silence seemed louder than any argument could have been. Daniel reached for the paperwork and began turning pages. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. He studied every line as though he expected the words to change. They did not. My mother remained seated, staring at the documents without touching them. For the first time since Grandma's funeral, she seemed uncertain. Eventually, she looked up at me. "Why would she do this without telling us?" she asked quietly. It was not an accusation. It sounded more like a question she had been asking herself for a very long time. I thought about everything I had discovered over the previous week. The storage unit, the journals, the letters, the conversations with Michael. Most of all, I thought about Grandma's observations written across years of careful notes. She had watched. She had listened. She had made her decision. "I think she did tell us," I replied. "Maybe we just were not listening." Nobody responded. There was nothing left to debate. The records existed. The deed existed. The county had accepted the transfer years earlier. The truth did not require anyone's approval. It simply existed. The realtor gathered her materials and quietly excused herself. Within minutes, Daniel followed. Before leaving, he paused near the doorway. For a moment, I thought he might argue or demand an explanation. Instead, he simply nodded once and walked outside. Soon only my mother and I remained at the table. The same table where, days earlier, she had confidently explained why the house belonged to someone else. The difference now was not the paperwork. The difference was that the assumptions had finally been replaced by facts. My mother looked older than I remembered. Grief had affected all of us more deeply than we admitted. "I never expected any of this," she said softly. I believed her. Sometimes people convince themselves of a story because it feels easier than confronting a more complicated reality. I reached across the table and gently placed Grandma's handwritten note in front of her. The one I had found among the storage records. The one that said kindness was not weakness. My mother read it without speaking. Then she folded the paper and slipped it into her purse. We did not solve every family problem that afternoon. Real life rarely works that way. But something important changed. The pretending ended. A few weeks later, I returned to the farmhouse alone. The evening sun painted the fields gold. I sat on the porch swing and watched shadows stretch across the yard. The house felt peaceful, not because I owned it, because I finally understood why Grandma had protected it. It had never been about property. It had never been about money. It was about trust. It was about character. It was about making sure the truth survived long enough to be found. As the breeze moved gently through the trees, I remembered the